In the 19th year of the faith, the 22nd of April, 1863, Bahá'u'lláh emerged from the inner room of the house he had been occupying and set out on the road of exile with Abdu'l-Bahá towards the garden of Ridván that lay on the east bank of the river Tigris. On his head he wore conspicuously a taj, a tall, beautifully adorned felt hat that he from that moment on would wear throughout his ministry. People of every rank, nationality and walk of life gathered from all quarters of the city and thronged the approaches to his house. Men and women of every age, friends and strangers from every social class, the poor, the orphaned and the outcast, merchants, notables, clerics and officials, all waited, amazed, heartbroken and apprehensive. As Bahá'u'lláh stepped outside, a rush of people poured forward from all directions, humbling themselves before him, weeping greatly. Bahá'u'lláh stood for some time amidst the weeping and lamenting hearts, speaking words of comfort and promising to receive each of them later in the garden. When he had walked some way toward the gate, amid the crowds, a child of just a few years rushed forward and clung to his robes, weeping aloud and begging in his tender voice that he not leave. As he descended the steps from the courtyard into the narrow street, the entire area was thronging with people, both believers and others, and all movement was impossible. Suckling babies were cast under Bahá'u'llah's feet, and men threw themselves in his path, hoping that his feet might touch them and bless them as he passed. They were lamenting the departure of one who for a decade had imparted to them the warmth of his love and the radiance of his spirit, who had been the refuge and guide for all. Everyone was crying, pressing in to approach Bahá'u'lláh, to hear his words, touch him, or receive a comforting glance, howling and weeping at their loss, seeing no more value in life. Bahá'u'lláh bade each person farewell, caressing and soothing everyone. Such grief they had that all those who were to accompany Bahá'u'lláh sorrowed along with those to be left behind. The streets and housetops all along his way were crowded with Bahá'u'llah's friends. Such a commotion Baghdad had rarely seen. Upon the way and with an open hand, Bahá'u'lláh provided to the poor he had so faithfully befriended, uttering words of comfort to the disconsolate, until at long last, Bahá'u'lláh managed to reach the banks of the river Tigris. As he prepared to cross, he entrusted the city of Baghdad to his devoted friends, that through their deeds and conduct, the flame of love would continue to glow within the hearts of its people. Bahá'u'lláh boarded a small boat waiting for him. The boat pushed off and ferried Bahá'u'lláh across the water, in company with Abdu'l-Bahá, the purest branch, another of his sons and his secretary, and the companions on the bank all watched with sorrowing hearts as he receded into the distance. Bahá'u'lláh set foot on the opposite bank and crossed into the garden at 2 hours to sunset, just as the call of God is the greatest resounded throughout the district from the pinnacles of the mosque, summoning the inhabitants to the late afternoon prayer. Shortly after Bahá'u'llah's arrival, the river rose up, making it difficult to cross. An extraordinary exhilaration, a marvelous exaltation in the atmosphere filled the companions that day. As they remained watching on the bank, they were aware of this, yet unable to understand what, in due time, they would come to learn. For 12 days, Bahá'u'lláh stayed in the garden and would be found each day in the utmost joy, walking majestically in the flower-lined avenues and amongst the trees. The friends living in Baghdad would come during the day and return home each night, whilst others would be engaged in service to those in the garden. Eminent rulers, clergy and jurists would come continuously to Baha'u'llah's tent with their insoluble problems and take their leave satisfied with their dilemmas entirely solved. On the very first day of the Ridván festivities, Baha'u'llah shone out to the world like the most brilliant sun. At that critical hour and without warning, Baha'u'llah chose to lay bare the mystery surrounding his person, assuming the power and authority of the one promised by the Bab. He made known how the effulgence of the eternal truth had at that moment infused all created things with the life of every divine quality, immersing creation in the sea of purification. The sword was to be utterly cast from reach, and he made it known that the next messenger would come to the world only after 1,000 years. In such a way and through many signs, Baha'u'llah conveyed his position to those who were present and announced with great joy the start of the festival of Ridván. Though on the threshold of his exile into great suffering in faraway lands, yet sadness and grief entirely vanished from everyone's hearts, replaced with unclouded delight. Each day in the garden, before the sun had dawned, the gardeners would pick the roses which lined the 4 avenues and pile them up in the centre of the floor inside Baha'u'llah's tent. So great would be the heap that his companions gathering to drink their morning tea in his presence would be unable to see each other across it. Baha'u'llah would entrust these roses with his own hands to the friends he would send out each morning to be delivered to his friends in the city. For some days there was much wind and Baha'u'llah's tent was swaying about. The friends took it in turns throughout the night and day to sit and keep the tent rope steady in case it should be blown down, their whole happiness in so doing, being able to be so near to Baha'u'llah. Every morning and afternoon, Baha'u'llah would speak of the Bab's cause and intimate his own. The notables and ordinary devoted people of the city, yearning to visit Baha'u'llah, were unable to bear their separation and would arrive from Baghdad each day in streams and a succession of waves, offering their last farewell, and take their leave with feelings of profound sorrow. On the 5th night, one of the companions was watching beside Baha'u'llah's tent, keeping the rope steady. As midnight approached, Baha'u'llah came out from his tent, and he passed by the places where some of his companions were sleeping. He began to pace up and down the moonlit, flower-bordered avenues of the garden. The nightingales were singing so loudly on every side, only those nearby could make out his voice. Baha'u'llah continued to walk and paused amidst an avenue. He observed how the nightingales were sleepless from dusk till dawn, enraptured with their love for the roses, communing in a burning passion of melody. How, he asked, could those afire with the rose-like beauty of the beloved choose to sleep? For 3 nights the same companion watched and circled around his tent and found Baha'u'llah wakeful at all times, whilst each day from morning to evening Baha'u'llah would be engaged in ceaseless conversation with the streams of visitors flowing continuously into his presence. 4 days before Baha'u'llah's departure from the garden, he called Abdu'l-Baha to his tent, and there disclosed in clear terms that he was the one to be manifest by God promised by the Bab. As the Master heard these soul-stirring words, he understood why the manifestation had once more received such persecution, and he came to see, as a radiant vision, the world of the future when the divine message will have changed the heart of the world. From that moment onward, a new and increased joy and devotion took possession of him, and he consecrated his whole self, body, soul, and spirit to the sacred work of the cause. Later, within the garden, Baha'u'llah made the same declaration to 4 others. The time was not yet to come for a public declaration, and he enjoined these few to keep their new understanding secret. On the 9th day, the river settled down and the flood waters receded, and Baha'u'llah's family crossed over into the garden, and the river overflowed a second time. The flooding subsided again on the 12th day, and everyone went across the river to enter the presence of Baha'u'llah. The day at last came to a close, and Baha'u'llah announced that he would be leaving the coming afternoon. The mules were loaded. All the young men and others able to ride mounted their horses, and in the late afternoon of 3rd of May 1863, at the moment of the full moon, the company began upon its way. Baha'u'llah showered everyone with sweet words of consolation, and he waved farewell to all. As he mounted and was ready to depart, there was a great outpouring of grief. The lamentation, anguish, and heart-rending, unbearable cries of distress of the friends, and the sorrow and mourning of all the people was such that no one can ever depict. Time and again the call, "God is the greatest," rang out from amongst the crowd. Those who Baha'u'llah had indicated were to remain behind stood in a row. They were so entirely overcome with sorrow that they all burst into tears. Baha'u'llah drew back up to them and consoled them. He assured them it was better for the cause that they should stay behind. One of the friends was utterly beyond all control of anguish and sorrow, and addressed the crowd with a poem, declaring, "Let us all rise to weep like the clouds of spring. When lovers become separated from their beloved, you hear even the wailings of the stones." Heads on every side bowed down to the dust at the feet of Baha'u'llah's horse and kissed its feet. Countless individuals pressed forward to embrace his stirrups. Many cast themselves in front of the horse, preferring death to separation. It seemed as if it were a heavenly steed passing over blessed bodies and pure hearts. The scenes of tumultuous enthusiasm were as spectacular and even more touching than at his departure for the garden. Believers and unbelievers alike sobbed and lamented, and the chiefs and notables congregated there were struck with wonder, as no one escaped the all-encompassing emotions, rising up to such heights that no tongue could ever describe. Among the bowing and fervent multitude of admirers, the affection and grief were visible all around. Through the power of God, Baha'u'llah rode forth from the garden with such majesty and power as none could fail to acknowledge. The marks of homage and devotion continued to surround him until he reached Istanbul. Those left behind saw Baha'u'llah disappear from their sight toward an unknown destination. Sad at heart and utterly distressed in soul, as they returned empty-hearted and disconsolate to Baghdad, little did they know that Baha'u'llah was like the sun starting to rise towards its zenith. Yet they felt unspeakable joy surging within them, overcoming all their bitter sorrows with a great and mysterious radiancy. The friends gathered together and encouraged each other to spread out and teach what had just been declared. And though actively serving the cause, all their hearts wished for was to find their way near to Baha'u'llah.